Kwekwe, Ulakot, Tansi, hello, bonjour. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui du territoire traditionnel de Mississaugas of the Credit, où nous honorons tous les peuples autochtones qui ont pagayé ces eaux et dont les mocassins ont parcouru ces terres. Hier, dans une semaine très difficile, nous avons participé à une cérémonie émouvante, fruit de travail acharné de tant de familles, de survivants, de femmes autochtones et de personnes de LGBTQIA+. Nous remercions tous les partenaires qui ont contribué à l'élaboration d'un plan d'action national qui serait efficace et responsable. En tant que gouvernement, nous nous engageons à travailler avec vous pour assurer la sécurité des femmes et des filles autochtones et des personnes de LGBTQIA+, peu importe où elles vivent. As part of the National Action Plan, we released the Federal Pathway, the Government of Canada's contribution. The pathway, like the National Action Plan, is a living document that will be improved at regular intervals in order to be accountable for its effectiveness now and into the future. The federal pathway represents a whole of government approach, responding to the 4 themes identified in the National Inquiry's final report: culture, health and wellness, human safety and security, and justice. The pathway takes comprehensive actions to address the socioeconomic root causes, including culture, languages, community safety, poverty, food insecurity, employment, education, health and wellness, infrastructure, housing, and quality of life for all Indigenous peoples. It is backed up with the concrete measures from Budget 2021 and the Fall Economic Statement. This includes clear benchmarks for progress, informed by reliable data and research through a robust data strategy. This is essential to be able to measure, adapt, and keep the government accountable now and into the future. We thank our advisors, Claudette Dumont-Smith, Jean Taillé, and Mary Sillett, and the dedicated public servants that committed themselves to this important work. Inspired and guided by the wise counsel of families, survivors, and working in collaboration with all contributing partners, we are taking concrete actions to end the violence against First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women, girls, and to LGBTQIA+ people. Miigwech, Nakamik, Marcy, thank you, merci beaucoup. I will now turn it over to Minister Lametti.
Merci, Madame la Ministre. Je vous transmets mes salutations à partir de mon bureau qui se trouve sur le territoire traditionnel du peuple algonquin. Si cette conférence de presse avait lieu il y a 8 jours, mes remarques seraient sûrement différentes. Vendredi dernier nous a bouleversés. Our country is still absorbing the meaning of the horrible news from Kamloops, the discovery of a mass grave with the bodies of 215 Indigenous children at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. I will admit that I'm still processing it. I'm heartbroken and angry, and perhaps most sadly, I'm not surprised. This discovery illuminates a tragic and shameful part of Canada's history. It underscores the work we need to do as a country to fully understand, acknowledge, and respond to the national tragedy of residential schools. It's also further motivation for me to do what I can to advance reconciliation. And as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, I'm looking at all my options within my portfolio to address what we learned last week. In the midst of these tragic circumstances, we must continue to collaborate and advance our shared work towards the achievement of reconciliation in Canada. The federal pathway is part of that process. Le thème justice contenu dans la voie fédérale porte sur les mesures et les investissements qui contribueront à rendre le système de justice plus équitable, inclusif et représentatif. Ça commence avec des investissements de plus de 74,8 millions de dollars dans le budget de 2021. Ces fonds servent à supporter le travail nécessaire de lutte contre la discrimination systémique et la surreprésentation des Autochtones dans notre système de justice, en plus d'améliorer l'accès à la justice. These investments will go towards continued engagement and collaboration with Indigenous partners on shared justice-related priorities and on a national Indigenous justice strategy, helping Indigenous families navigate the justice system with the help of new funding for programs under the Indigenous Court Work Program and the Indigenous Justice Program. New funding for community-based and culturally responsive family mediation supports. This will help address issues before they escalate to the criminal justice system. Reviving the Law Commission of Canada. Its work will include addressing systemic barriers to justice faced by Indigenous peoples and modernizing our justice data collection to collect disaggregated data. Ces investissements s'ajoutent aux efforts que nous faisons pour atteindre ces objectifs. We remain committed to supporting self-determination through the development of administration of justice agreements with Indigenous communities and to better implement GLADU principles in the justice system, in which we invested in the fall economic statement close to $50 million. Nous continuons de soutenir les unités de liaison pour l'information à l'intention des familles, the FILUs, qui aident les familles à composer avec le traumatisme et la perte d'un être cher disparu ou assassiné. Et nous poursuivons nos efforts pour adopter le projet de loi C-15, la loi sur la Déclaration des Nations unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. C-15 fait expressément référence aux appels à la justice formulés dans le rapport final sur les FFADA et à la nécessité de tenir compte du genre ainsi que de plusieurs formes de diversité dans notre approche. We have, in response to TRC Call to Action 50, announced 2 weeks ago, investments of $10 million in 21 projects across Canada to help revitalize Indigenous justice systems. And these are Indigenous-led projects, ground up across Canada. And finally, Bill C-22, which proposes sentencing reforms to help reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. This week has been difficult for so many, but I believe that change is possible. Ensemble, nous pouvons bâtir un avenir meilleur pour tous les peuples autochtones, un avenir dans lequel les femmes, les filles et les personnes de LGBTQ+ autochtones seront entendues, valorisées et protégées. I will now turn to my colleague, Minister Vandal, to say a few words. Merci, thank you, miigwech, nekramik, merci, niawan.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Tansi Boshu, bonjour and good morning. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from my office in St. Boniface, St. Vital, City of Winnipeg, homeland of the Métis Nation, Treaty 1 territory, in a city that is now home to many Inuit. Before I begin, I want to recognize the horrific news that we learned last week of the locating of the remains of 215 children in the Kamloops Residential School. It is a reminder of the consequences of colonialism for Indigenous peoples and their communities. We must not forget the victims. We must not forget the children who were sent to these institutions, those that came home, and we must never forget those that did not come home. Our thoughts are with the Kamloops Secwepemc First Nations. This government is strongly committed to reconciliation, healing, and justice for the former students of residential schools, as well as the missing and murdered women and girls, survivors, and their loved ones. As the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and children has emphasized, gender-based and racially motivated violence against Indigenous peoples is systemic, with roots in colonization. And the scars of colonization run deep in the North. They are evident in the social and economic inequities and injustices faced by Inuit, First Nations, and Métis every day, from inadequate housing to food insecurity to inaccessible healthcare. La réponse du Canada à cette tragédie nationale doit reposer sur des distinctions afin de tenir compte des réalités spécifiques de tous les Autochtones, que ce soit dans les communautés urbaines, rurales, éloignées ou nordiques. C'est exactement ce que fait notre voie fédérale. Nous faisons de nouveaux investissements pour améliorer la sécurité et construire de nouveaux refuges pour les femmes et les enfants inuits dans l'Inuit Nunangat, ainsi que dans les secteurs urbains en s'appuyant sur ceux qui ont été faits dans l'énonce économique de l'automne, qui a annoncé 724 millions de dollars pour lancer une stratégie globale de prévention de la violence. Le budget 2021 propose 50 millions en aide immédiate au logement dans le Nord ainsi que 4,3 milliards de dollars en infrastructures communautaires autochtones, fondées sur les distinctions pour aider à répondre aux besoins critiques en matière de logement et infrastructures. Nous nous occupons également de l'insécurité alimentaire dans les communautés du Nord. En effet, le budget 2021 propose de nouveaux investissements de 163 millions sur 3 ans en collaboration avec des partenaires afin que des familles puissent obtenir des aliments abordables et des aliments nutritifs. There is still so much more work to do. To support this work, we are providing sustainable funding to national, to regional, and local Indigenous organizations across Canada and across the North. Budget 21 is proposing to provide more than $36 million over 5 years and $8.6 million on an ongoing basis to enhance support for Indigenous women's and 2SL LGBTQIA+ organizations, ensuring that their voices are reflected in all aspects of decision making. The safety and the well-being of all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children, and 2SL LGBTQIA+ people in the North and all across Canada is our priority. And we are committed to continuing to work together in partnership to get there. Miigwech, merci, thank you. Minister Monsef.
Thank you so much, Dan. Hello, everybody. Bonjour, Anin, salam alaikum. I join you from my home in Peterborough, Kawartha, on Mississauga and Anishinaabe territory. My community is still reeling from the recent loss of Selena Taylor, a daughter, a friend, a loved one, and we will all continue to work toward justice for her and for so many more of our Indigenous sisters. I'd like to begin also by expressing my profound gratitude to every single person, elders, grandmothers, firekeepers, ministries, organizers, partners, survivors and their families who ensured that yesterday was possible and that yesterday was done in ceremony. As a newcomer to Canada about 25 years ago, my family and I have been on this path to reconciliation since we were brand new to Peterborough, since we were brand new to this country. But it took years for us to truly understand the stories that were created because of the history of colonialism, sexism, racism, and misogyny. It was in 2015, it was October 4th, 2015. It was during the first election, and I attended a vigil here in Peterborough at Millennium Park with my 5-year-old niece. And everybody was standing in a circle. It was a rainy day, and as you can appreciate, there was real sorrow in that circle. Everybody was holding hands. back when it was safe to hold hands like that. And as the ceremony finished, my niece looked up to me and said, "Why is everybody so sad?" And I had to do my best to explain to this little girl the story of little girls which didn't get to unfold. And I had to explain to her how those stories actually ended. And that day, as a candidate and as a Canadian, I made a promise, and as an aunt, that I would do everything I can to change the story that parents and loved ones have to tell the little ones in their lives. I'm really proud of the work that's been done. It's been done in a good way, in solid partnerships. People have taken time, and we are now all on the same page. We are working towards the same direction, a future free of violence for all, but particularly Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA folks. We're all rowing in the same direction. There is a plan that is financed with over $2 billion. We are accountable first and foremost to families and survivors, and they will continue to guide us over the course of the years ahead on this path. This plan also includes a strong partner already in the territory of Yukon. You heard from Minister Dendies yesterday. Their entire plan is the best of its kind. All you have to do is copy and paste it at this point because they've done the work. And we look forward to working with all provinces and territories so that we can end this national tragedy and change the story. The work moving ahead through my department involves closing the cell gaps. The highways of tears across this country need not exist. There's $50 million to address that. There's additional funds for internet access, and we've heard the call for enhanced rural transportation. Minister McKenna and Goody Hutchings are working on that. We are moving ahead with Canada's second action plan on addressing and preventing all forms of gender-based violence. This is a funded plan with hundreds of millions of dollars, and we'll be ready to roll it out in the coming weeks. We are moving ahead also with establishing a secretariat to address and prevent gender-based violence within the Government of Canada, and we look forward to input from partners involved in the work on the path to reconciliation. We're enhancing GBA Plus, and we're rolling out new funds for Indigenous women's organizations, building on the partnerships we've created with over 170 of them to date. And we are going to continue to ensure that nothing for you without you. You will continue to be at the table. Back in 2013, through the YWCA, I was able to attend the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And every session that the Government of Canada hosted in that gathering was interrupted by feminists of all backgrounds calling on the government to make the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls a priority. It was not a priority at that time. We have come a long way since, but as all the speakers yesterday said, this is only a beginning, and we must build on the momentum. We must build on the momentum, and every day is an opportunity to move forward. Last week, my niece told me that in the group chat for her class, one of the boys had said that 215 bodies of children had been dug up and that there were children under her school too. Our children, settlers and otherwise Indigenous, are asking really difficult questions, particularly in light of the discovery of those bodies in Kamloops last week. I truly hope that we can all tell them a less difficult story moving forward, but I also believe that they are going to be strong partners for us on this path. Lastly, let me thank Minister Bennett. My first meeting as Minister for Women was with her and Indigenous partners. Dr. Bennett, you've taken me under your wings as a candidate and as a politician, You've included me in this work. You have moved forward to address and remove sex discrimination in the Indian Act. We have more work to do. You've helped with many land claims, settlements, and you've moved forward with clean water advisories being removed, boiled water advisories being removed for so many communities. Carolyn Bennett, you're a great Canadian, and I thank you for your work. Miigwech to all families and survivors. I hope that the healing can begin now. I'll now pass it to the one and only Minister Miller.
Thank you, Minister Monsef. Kwekwe Tanse Nusakut, good morning et bonjour. I first want to acknowledge that as I'm in Ottawa, I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I want to start off by saying that, as my colleagues have said, with all Canadians, we continue to be profoundly saddened by the news of children buried at the former Kamloops residential school. Our thoughts continue to be with the Kamloops Secwepemc First Nation, as well as with all Indigenous peoples across Canada. We acknowledge that this has been a profoundly painful week for Indigenous peoples all over the country. We're grieving these victims and reliving their own painful memories. Canada remains dedicated to supporting survivors' families and memorializing those lost, innocent souls. The trauma of residential schools has caused lives with many, and last week's tragic discovery makes those painful emotions to surface. It's ruined lives. If you need someone to talk to, the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available to provide emotional and support services to former residential school students 24 hours a day. The Hope for Wellness Line as well is available options to all Indigenous peoples. And you can chat with a counselor on their website at www.wellness.ca or by phoning 1-855-242-3310, 855-242-3310. Understanding this difficult truth and the pain it's caused reinforces the urgent need and responsibility that this government has to work towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Yesterday's announcement is specifically geared towards addressing the intergenerational traumas that continue to have an impact on Indigenous communities across the country. Hier marquait le 2e anniversaire de la sortie du rapport final de l'enquête nationale sur les femmes et les filles autochtones disparues ou assassinées. J'aimerais prendre un moment pour tendre la main à toutes les victimes, les survivantes, ainsi qu'à leurs familles. Le Canada est un pays qui se veut inclusif et sécuritaire pour tous. Personne ne devrait avoir à vivre dans la peur et dans la violence. Mais c'est la réalité quotidienne de la vaste majorité des Autochtones. Au courant de ces dernières années, nous avons travaillé sans relâche afin de répondre aux appels à la justice énoncés dans le rapport. Hier, le plan d'action national 2021 mettre fin à la violence faite aux femmes et aux filles et aux personnes de LGBTQIA+ autochtones a été publié avec la contribution de partenaires partout à travers le pays. Des investissements de 2,2 milliards de dollars ont été prévus, notamment dans le budget 2021, afin de permettre de mettre ce plan d'action sur pied. The federal pathway inscribed in the broader National Action Plan details the concrete actions Canada will pursue to end systemic racism, sexism, ableism, and economic inequality that has continued to perpetuate and allow violence against Indigenous women and girls and to SLGBTQIA+ people to occur. Our hope is that the National Action Plan and the federal pathway will begin as a starting point to addressing the calls for justice. The national document is evergreen and will continue to change to adjust and respond to the needs of those who have been wronged. Together, we'll seek to build a better, safer Canada where current and future generations of Indigenous women, girls, and 2SL LGBTQIA+ people are not at risk of harm. Miigwech, Nakumik, Merci Cho, merci.
Merci. We'll now take questions from journalists, one question and one follow-up. I ask that you please begin by stating your name and the media outlet you represent, as well as who the question is for. Alors, nous allons maintenant prendre les questions des journalistes. Une question et une question de suivi. Merci d'indiquer le nom de média auquel vous êtes associé et de mentionner à qui s'adresse votre question. Operator, do we have the first question on the phone?
Yes, thank you, merci. Please press *1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur l'étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. There will be a brief pause while the participants register for questions. Il y aura un court délai vous permettant de vous enregistrer dans la file d'attente pour la période de questions. Thank you for your patience. Merci de patienter. The first question is from David Aiken of Global News. Your line is now open. Please go ahead.
Good morning, ministers, and thank you for taking our questions. I think this is for Minister Bennett, although it's good to have Minister Lametti here as it's about a court case. But Minister Bennett, as you may know, 105 First Nations bands are suing the government for harm caused to entire communities by the residential school system. That lawsuit began in 2012, certified 2015 as a class action. But I guess a lot of people, and certainly members of those communities, are confused why the federal government would not move to negotiate some sort of settlement about that claim, about that harm caused to entire communities, rather than force these First Nations to actually go to trial. Could you help explain why that is the strategy the government is pursuing, to force essentially a court date?
David, if I understand correctly, this is the Day Scholars case?
It's now two cases. The Day Scholars is one case. The Day Scholars are suing the federal government as well, but also the bands are as well. So it started out Day Scholars and bands together. It got split in 2015 into two classes. The Day Scholars is one class, I understand, and the bands are a separate class.
I think, David, the answer is in that obviously we are doing everything in our power to get out of court and to get to the negotiating table. The Day Scholars were clear with us that the aging survivors and the descendants were a priority for them. And so we have been at the table with them to be able to sort out an appropriate settlement for them. That was the priority of the survivors and the descendants, and that is the work that we're doing right now.
And thank you for that. And I guess I have heard, of course, Minister Miller's responded a couple of times this week about, and questions from the opposition about the Human Rights Tribunal case and the government strategy in that. But maybe, I think this is Minister Bennett again, I think, just on the lawsuit involving the St. Anne's residential school survivors. All they want is documents from the government, if I understand the case correctly. They're not really about money at this point. It's simply about knowledge. And to the extent that the federal government has documents, wondering why, again, in this case, why fight residential survivors in court? Why not hand over the documents?
Well, I think in terms of in asking for the court direction on this, we have now been able to hand over the documents in question to former Judge Ian Pitfield. We had thought that the compensation had been completed. He will look at all of the documents under the court order to review any steps in the process and to make sure everybody was able to receive the compensation that they deserved. We are also working with the survivors on a priority of theirs towards healing processes and making sure that they are supported in that work, and that is the status right now.
David, if I might add,
next
it's
question.
an important piece of if I might add to David Aiken's question, an important piece of context. The government of Canada went to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2016, arguing that all the documents should be preserved and that no document should be destroyed. And we lost that case. And so we have a Supreme Court of Canada decision that says we have to destroy documents. So what we are doing is we are trying to push that back as far as possible and give every opportunity to St. Anne's survivors and others to be able to get access to the documents that they may need in order to make the cases that they do. And we're trying to do that sensitively, and we're trying to do that in a way that helps the families. But we do have ultimately a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada that we have to respect.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you, merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Jamie Pashagumskum of APTN News. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Thank you. My question is concerning yesterday's announcement of the National Action Plan. Now, critics of the plan are saying that it's lacking any, specific responsibilities assigned, as well as timelines, concrete timelines. They're calling it just a collection of statements and promises. What would you have to say to that?
Well, maybe I'll start, Jamie, but firstly, I just want to thank the 100 of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people that work so hard on the National Action Plan with all of the partners centered by the Family and Survivors Circle. And so that is a consensus document moving forward, and we will move now on to the implementation plan that will include the investments, timelines, and accountability framework. We now have a very robust data strategy that the data working group has given us as a roadmap as to the indicators and the ways that and even the data sets that we're going to have to work very hard to get to be able to establish process and be able to say that this evergreening document will have to have the ability to be regularly updated based on results, that we measure, adapt, both today's federal pathway and the National Action Plan really will be accountable to all of the families and survivors coast to coast to coast. It means that no one will ever be able to accuse any of the partners of having this plan sit on a shelf. We will continue to be able to be accountable for the results we're getting, and the timelines and the funding will be explicit in the implementation plan. But as you can see, Jamie, in the federal pathway today, there are very clear investments that came out of the fall economic statement as well as budget 2021 that have some of the timelines there in terms of the consistent funding. And I just want to say I am so proud of the work that the Family and Survivors Group have done. And I mean, even this the Two-Spirited document, like it should be compulsory reading in every classroom in this country as how, homosexuality and it was normal by, Two-Spirited people were normal. They were revered in their communities, and that homophobia arrived on the boats, as Sylvia Maracle says. And so we will work with all of the partners to get the kind of education that has been revealed in the urban reality, the Two-Spirited, but with all of the guidance of the Family and Survivor Circle. This is a very, very, very important milestone in the history of Canada, for which some families and survivors came to talk to me about 20 years ago. I'm very proud that we got to this day.
Jamie, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned the implementation plan. So what kind of action can we expect this fall?
Well, the plan that we have control over is the federal pathway, and we are promising that we will have that implementation plan this year, and we are hoping that in terms of the work we've been saying the work with the Families and Survivors Circle and the data group and the implementation plan. Now that we've seen all the chapters from all of our partners, we've said that June 4th we begin the work on the implementation plan, and we're going to roll up our sleeves and get that done. But again, in true partnership with all of our partners, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, the provinces and territories, and being able to make sure that as we've said, we will not let the families and survivors down, and we will be working in close collaboration to make sure that their wise counsel is at the heart of our work on implementation.
Jamie, if I may, I think we all recognize that some grief is inconsolable. Nothing's going to bring back our stolen sisters, and that is certainly to be acknowledged and understood. This plan, though, is the first of its kind, I think, anywhere in the world. The way that it was developed with partners across the country, with families and survivors at the heart of it, with the public service working together. I mean, Gina Wilson and Valerie Gideon co-chaired this and moved it forward so that it's part of the public service efforts as well. It is well funded with over $2 billion, and it is accountable to families, and we will be measuring our progress. It is also aligned with the work we're doing with Canada's Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence in all its forms. So there is further alignments, and the two will move forward together. You're right, though, Jamie. The federal government alone cannot complete this work on our own. And moving forward, provinces and territories have been reckoning with these stories and realities for years and decades. They're coming up with their own plans. For us, we'll continue to keep families and survivors at the table, of course, but we'll be rolling out the funds in budget 2021. So women's organizations, Indigenous-led, supporting Indigenous communities across the country are going to build on their capacity with increased core funding as well as operational funding for their programs, services, and research to move ahead. We're strengthening the base for this work within the federal government with a secretariat specifically focused on gender-based violence. And as you heard Minister Miller and Vandal and Bennett say, this is a live document too. It won't just sit on a shelf. It will just get stronger and stronger as Canadians' resolve to end this national tragedy gets stronger and stronger. And our government will be there to close those cell gaps, to address the highways of tears, and to do right by those whose stories ended too soon.
Thank you, Minister. Next question, please, operator.
Thank you, merci. The next question, la prochaine question is from Geneviève Normand, CBC Radio-Canada. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour, merci de prendre ma question. J'apprécierais d'abord une réponse dans les deux langues, s'il vous plaît. Et ma question s'adresse à vous, ministre Miller ou encore ministre Lametti. En fait, c'est que ce matin, il y a des experts des Nations Unies qui demandent aux autorités canadiennes, en l'occurrence vous tous et toutes, et aussi à l'Église catholique, d'entreprendre des enquêtes approfondies à Kamloops. Et par enquête approfondie, on parle d'examens médico-légaux, l'identification des corps. Et en plus de ça, l'ONU exhorte aussi votre gouvernement à entreprendre des enquêtes similaires pour tous les autres sites des pensionnats autochtones à travers le pays. Alors, ma question, est-ce que vous vous engagez à répondre positivement à la requête des experts des Nations Unies?
Je dirais d'emblée, Geneviève, évidemment, question fort pertinente, mais c'est très important de rappeler à tout le monde que ce type de demande doit passer d'abord et avant tout par les nations et les communautés concernées. On parle notamment de communautés qui sont en deuil, qui ont les projecteurs de la nation braqués sur un site de crime désormais sacré. Et la question, en fait, oui, évidemment, le fédéral aura son mot à dire, mais ça passe à travers le consentement de la nation affectée qui est toujours en deuil. Alors, il y aura un temps et un moment pour réfléchir et pour répondre à cette question. Je sais très bien que la GRC vient d'ouvrir une enquête. On ne pourra pas parler davantage là-dessus, évidemment, pour ne pas affecter le cours de la perquisition et de tout ce qui pourrait suivre. Mais rappelons-nous encore une fois l'importance de mettre la nation, la communauté affectée, endeuillée, au centre de la prise de décision. C'est qu'on a oublié à faire par le passé et c'est des événements comme aujourd'hui où on se le rappelle nous-mêmes. I'll say it in English as well. And this is a very important question, but the framing of it is equally important. It is important to restate and underscore that this type of process that is can be particularly painful, can be particularly invasive, has to go through the consent of the nation and the communities that are affected. These are communities that are in pain. They are now currently going through their protocols. The eyes of the nation are focused on a site in Kamloops that is opening up wounds across the country for many people that are reliving memories. And we need to respect the process, the protocol of nations involved. They have said so, and we will do so. There's a time for the federal government to get involved, and we will support this, but it goes squarely through the nations involved, and there will be a time for this. Let's remember again that this is potentially a crime scene, but also may well be considered sacred grounds, and people will have views on these that we will need to respect, whether we agree with them or disagree with them. Is not. I understand the RCMP has opened a case. It is very, very difficult to comment further on this so that we don't affect the course of the investigation. I think I'm probably at more liberty to say things than Minister Lametti would be able to say in his capacity as Attorney General, but obviously we should allow him the time to answer in English and French as well.
Merci, merci Juliette pour la question. Oui, en tant que procureur général, je ne pourrais pas commenter davantage sur les enquêtes actuelles ou en cours. Mais ce que je peux vous dire, c'est qu'en tant que gouvernement, en tant que ministre et au niveau politique, nous allons coopérer, évidemment, dans la mesure possible. Mais tout le temps avec le respect que le ministre Miller vient de souligner. Il faut respecter la volonté des communautés, des familles, des survivants. C'est primordial. So just to say the same thing in English, as Attorney General, I can't comment on ongoing investigations. They're independent of my function as Attorney General. But I can say that on a political level, as the Minister of Justice, we will cooperate as a government where we can cooperate politically, but always with the primordial consideration of the interests of communities, First Nations, Indigenous communities, families, survivors. We have to be very sensitive to what they want and how they want to proceed.
Très bien, merci pour vos réponses. En question de suivi, j'ai très bien compris là, que le gouvernement fédéral va vouloir mettre son mot, va vouloir participer, va vouloir coopérer. Vous avez parlé des nations, M. Miller. Les nations, en fait, on l'a vu là, depuis vendredi dernier, tout ce qu'elles demandent, c'est que la vérité sorte. Il y a eu 130 pensionnats autochtones à travers le pays. Est-ce que vous allez être l'instigateur d'une enquête peut-être publique? Comment est-ce que vous allez articuler ces enquêtes-là pour que la lumière soit faite sur chacun des sites de tous ces 130 pensionnats autochtones? Est-ce que, autrement dit, vous allez prendre le flambeau au nom de toutes les nations? Comment allez-vous articuler les recherches?
Écoutez, je vais vous donner une réponse qui peut paraître d'emblée équivoque, ça ne l'est pas du tout. On sait très bien que par le passé, l'idée que le fédéral a toutes les réponses a causé des dommages incalculables et aujourd'hui en est un beau témoignage. Il faut savoir qu'on n'a pas toutes les réponses et c'est de ce point de principe qu'il faut procéder. C'est clair qu'au niveau opérationnel, nous avons un centre coordonné d'urgence de tous les ministères qui sont impliqués pour répondre à cette crise, cet endeuillement national. D'abord, pour mettre l'emphase sur les communautés affectées et pour les aider dans leur processus d'établissement de protocole, mais c'est c'est en les appuyant qu'on va avoir qu'on va pouvoir ressortir leur voix, les mettre dans l'avant-plan. Et maintenant, c'est une question de respecter leur deuil, leur demande de sécurité, de sécurisation des sites, leur demande d'appui en santé mentale. Et ensuite, regarder ce qui se passe à travers le pays, c'est-à-dire notamment dans ces lieux, il y en a, comme vous l'avez dit, une bonne centaine, et de voir avec les nations affectées quelle est leur approche et ce qu'ils veulent et ce qu'elles veulent. C'est un processus peut-être, comme je vous l'ai dit, qui peut vous sembler équivoque, mais loin d'avoir le fédéral comme porteur de flambeau, mais plus ou moins de coordonner toutes ces activités qui doivent avoir lieu. Je vous rappellerai que l'appel à l'action 71 interpelle les provinces dans la mesure où on a besoin de coronaires provinciaux. Et c'est quelque chose où on va avoir besoin de l'appui des provinces. J'ai aucune raison de croire que c'est le contraire. En fait, toutes les provinces auxquelles j'ai parlé, et inclus le ministre Lafrenière, sont là pour appuyer les démarches, le cas échéant. Il faut noter qu'il y a des nations qui peut-être veulent respecter le site sacré et ne pas procéder à des fouilles. Il y en a qui veulent tout à fait le contraire. Et puis, il faut respecter cette nuance. Et c'est là où on sera à l'appui. I'll provide this in English. It is a bit the same answer that I gave previously with respect to the international demands for investigations. This is something where we have to put the nations that are affected front and center. Where it may seem equivocal to some to say that the federal government doesn't have all the answers, it is a position of principle that we must respect. For far too long, we have said that we have had all the answers, and we know the effect that has had destructive on Indigenous communities. And today is a good example of the effects that has had. We will put the communities affected front and center. My focus and the focus of everyone on this line, as well as other ministers, is to support those communities in establishing their protocols and respecting their space, supporting them with mental health, securing the sites. Again, the eyes of the nations are focused on the Kamloops site, and that community is going through perhaps a much different process than the rest of us are, and we need to respect that. It doesn't mean that we won't be involved. It probably means more work, but to have the federal government at the front of this sort of betrays the importance to have Indigenous communities at the forefront. And to the greater question of the 100+ sites of former schools, there are different approaches in different nations as to how to proceed. These are potentially crime scenes, potentially sacred sites with survivors that do absolutely want answers, and some communities that do not want it touched at all. And that is the stark reality of it. There are some survivors who still do not want to speak about this. Their descendants perhaps do, but they don't. And that is the reality of the emotional pain that everyone is in. So we need to respect that. I think the media plays a key role in putting that point forward, which is why we keep repeating it. And we will keep repeating it, putting those nations at the forefront. It doesn't mean less work on the federal government. Frankly, it means more. And I would say this about the provinces, that the ones that I've reached out to have been immensely supportive. And I don't think there's a single one that isn't supportive in doing this the right way. And that includes Call to Action 71, which does directly implicate coroners of the province in the case of communities that want to do more investigations.
Merci.
I just wanted to add a little bit that in the support for calls to action 74 to 76, the engagement that has taken place just underlines what Minister Miller has said, that the communities affected were very clear. They wanted Indigenous-led, community-based, survivor-centric, and with commemoration or culturally sensitive. They wanted access to funding that would help them with their research, and as Marc has said, based on their protocols, archaeological expertise, as well as commemoration. And so this is the work that they are now doing, and that the funding is there for them to be able to for us to be flexible and do it the way they want to do based on their protocols, but based on the wise practices that so many of the leaders and experts know need to be there in terms of making sure it's done properly.
Thank you, Minister. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you, merci. La prochaine question. The next question is from Teresa Wright of the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Good morning, ministers. This question is for Minister Bennett. Yesterday, the MP for Nunavut, Mamela Kakak, she gave a very emotional speech in the House of Commons talking about how it is her belief and many others that the residential school system in Canada has been replaced by the foster care system. And she detailed that at great length. I know that Bill C-92 was passed 2 years ago, but a large and disproportionate number of Indigenous children are in the child welfare system, and many of them are living in hotels. They're vulnerable, and some have died by suicide in those hotels. I'm wondering what steps you're taking to stop this systemic situation that continues to exist where Indigenous children are far more likely to be taken from their parents and put in foster care.
I think Minister Miller would take this in terms of his extraordinary work on the transformational change that has to take place and will take place because of Bill C-92 to make sure that communities can assert jurisdiction over their children and youth and bring their youth home.
Thank you, Teresa. Teresa, you want me to answer that portion of the question, or?
Yes,
I'm glad to. I think it's important to speak about it from our perspective. It is a responsibility that's shared across government, but when it comes to transforming the broken childcare system, C-92, which is about the implementation of rights of Indigenous peoples that people like me take for granted, which is the right to have control and custody over your children, is one that may seem self-evident, but it hasn't been afforded to Indigenous peoples. And it is really a transformative document in so far as it allows nations to lift up their inherent rights over child and family services, which you'll recall from a constitutional perspective is very much a split jurisdiction between the federal government and provincial governments, which hence the genesis of Jordan's principles, which is transformed lives. And it's important to recall that Jordan's principle and its implementation, for which we've dedicated now well over $2 billion, and rightly so, to achieve substantive equality for children that haven't been afforded that, has really started to transform the system. And it's very much at a beginning. There's still children being removed, taken into care and dying. And the system is still one that is focused on intervention as opposed to prevention, in a way that does not reflect the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, if this is something that if people think will take a short period of time, they're not understanding the gravity of the situation. It'll take the full participation of provinces that run these care systems, that run a number of these child care systems, the transformation of their own laws, the lifting up foremost of Indigenous laws across the country. There are some communities with respect to which there are real challenges with respect to capacity, and those are the ones where the intervention still occurs. There are ones that are ready, and we've seen, for example, Cowessess or Wapsiwing in Northern Ontario lift up their laws, and we'll be there for them. I think the inevitable course of this question leads us to the one with respect to the number of court cases related to the compensation of First Nations children who have suffered discrimination at the hands of a broken childcare system. And I do want to reiterate what I said yesterday, that the federal government will give fair, just, and equitable compensation to those children that have suffered harms at the hands of the broken childcare system. Prime Minister said as much during the last election, and we have repeated as much. We are currently in talks with the parties, both to the two competing class actions and the CHRT, to move not only on compensation, but on transformative change. And I think it's important to recall in this context that no single court case or its resolution can achieve the transformative change that we need to achieve as a country, with First Nations at the forefront. It's long, it's slow, it will require billions of dollars of investments, but it will transform the lives of children that haven't been served by the child care system in a way that achieves that substantive equality. And if that isn't clear enough, let me remind people that over 50% of children in care are Indigenous. They represent 7% of the youth population in Canada.
Teresa, if I could add as well, another piece of it is the sentencing reform that's in Bill C-22. If by bringing back conditional sentencing and by conditional sentence orders and by eliminating as many minimum mandatory penalties as we can, we'll keep, which results in the over-incarceration of Indigenous adults, we'll keep them with their families, taking care of their children, which is where they should be, and that's an important part, particularly in particularly in the case of Indigenous women who are incarcerated for what are health problems, problematic addictions, and we should be keeping them home, taking care of their children, staying in their jobs, and staying in their communities in order to be properly supported.
Teresa, it's Dan Vandal here. The only thing I want to add is, in addition to what Minister Millers and Lametti have said, is this is all about prevention. And this plan this morning is about prevention. But we've been investing in prevention for the last 5 years, whether it's healthcare reform, whether it's education, whether it's justice. We've invested at least $30 billion of new money since 2015 in schools in Manitoba alone, in northern Manitoba. How do you build healthy communities? Well, we are investing in partnership with First Nations and Métis. We're investing $250 million to build 4 new schools in northern Manitoba, in Bunny Bunny B, in God's Lake, in Manitou-Sipi, and Wasagamik. That will keep 2,600 First Nations young people in their communities, whereas before they would have to move outside of their communities to get educated. Those are the sorts of base investments that government has never really done adequately. Not really. The government has never done adequately. So we are investing in partnership with Indigenous nations on those base preventative issues like schools and healthcare, so that we can build healthy communities, so that children stay out of the child welfare system. That's in addition to transforming the child welfare system.
Thank you. Teresa, did you have a follow-up?
Yes. I've this week there's been a lot of discussion about the discovery in Kamloops, and when speaking about the situation in residential schools, I've heard many people, and many of you, refer to it as a historic wrong against Indigenous children. Do you think it's fair to characterize Canada's mistreatment of Indigenous children as a historic wrong when, as Minister Miller just mentioned, a very large proportion of Indigenous children are continuing to be taken away from their parents?
I'll just start by saying absolutely, this is the Millennium Scoop, and the number of children still being taken from their families is totally unacceptable. And it means that we are working very hard in the decolonizing and the approach that somehow settlers thought they could look after children better. The movement of apprehending Indigenous children into non-Indigenous foster families is harmful, and we know it's harmful, and that's why Minister Miller is working as hard as he is to help all of the nations disentangle their relationships with provincial bodies or all of that, so they actually can assert jurisdiction. And I think as we move, even this afternoon with the signing of the Anishinaabe agreement with their well-being law, that this is what decolonizing looks like, and that Section 88 of the Indian Act no longer applies because of Bill C-92, and we are beginning that road of self-determination and the transformative change that that will be the future for Indigenous children to grow up proud of who they are as First Nations, Inuit, Métis, with that secure personal cultural identity that allows for much better, health, education, and economic outcomes. We want this stopped, and we are working very hard with the self-governing nations as well as the other nations. But the work that Minister Miller is doing with provinces and territories as well. This is a present danger to children, and we have to work on this as fast as we can. As everyone knows, there are more kids in care now than there were at the height of residential schools, and it's unacceptable and harmful.
Thank you,
Teresa,
Minister.
perhaps just to complete Minister Bennett's thoughts, there's been often a reference to a dark chapter in our history. It's a chapter that is incomplete, especially when you look at the after effects and how triggering the discovery this last Thursday night was for many people, and bringing back memories perhaps that were deeply suppressed, and that chapter is not complete. You simply have to look at the ongoing groundbreaking work done by reporters like Kenneth Jackson to see that the system continues to be broken. It's a system that needs to be reformed. At our level, at the provincial level, it's one, as Dan said, that needs to move from one that has been almost solely focused on intervention, which is immensely costly, to one that is one of prevention, which is costly, but moves us in the direction where we don't have to have these repeated scenes of people being removed. I'd remind people that the legislation that was passed just before we went into the election last year on child and family services came into effect a few months later and established a standard of the best interests of the child. Courts now have to apply that. People can't go into homes and intervene simply because it's crowded, because in comparison to non-Indigenous communities, that wouldn't happen. That standard will continue to be applied, but there's also that other aspect of it that is much longer, and that's the transformative change with nations lifting up their own legislation and taking care of their own, with a model that is culturally sensitive and focused squarely on prevention. The prevention work has started with significant investments from our government. We'll continue to support those nations, but there's a lot more work to be done, particularly in those most vulnerable communities across the country, where we are, where it is a constant battle in closing socioeconomic gaps.
Thank you, Minister. Just a note that some ministers have to leave for a question period. So we just have we have time for one last question. So operator, dernière question. Merci.
Merci, thank you. La dernière question, the last question, is from Olivia Stefanovich of CBC News. Please go ahead.
Good morning, ministers. Thank you for your time this morning. Minister Miller, you described this as a painful week. So has it led you and Minister Bennett to think differently about the government's approach to reconciliation? And if so, how? Do you think the government needs to move faster or more aggressively?
I can begin, Olivia, just in terms of my job is to accelerate the path to self-determination. I remember in 2002, when the Hollow Waters study came out of Manitoba, the quote, that healing is decolonization therapy. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we have to do. The paternalism has to be replaced by partnership, and we are doing everything we can to accelerate the pace with our partners to nation rebuilding, to actually that self-determination, helping and supporting nations as they develop their constitutions, as they revive their laws and policies, and make decisions in their own communities. And we are on that journey, and everything we do every day is to try and get that happening faster.
And thanks, Olivia. Look, this has been painful first and foremost for Indigenous communities, and I think there is a time to reflect on the speed of reconciliation, knowing that reconciliation has never been something that is necessarily easy or linear. I think all of us wish these things had never happened. We also have a responsibility to sit here and keep moving relentlessly forward when things sort of we have to recognize that there is a media frenzy around this that is very helpful in shining a light on things, and the work that you do is important in both holding us to account and raising this awareness for Canadians. There's also the after effect when all this sort of subsides, and that's where we have to continue our relentless work. It's why you have probably heard survivors or people that are remembering these things a little quiet this week, because they live it every day. And after this sort of news subsides, people are left still emotionally traumatized, and the difficult work that you are all shining a light on continues. This is obviously a government, and everyone knows that it has invested tens of billions into closing socioeconomic gaps, and that work is relentless. The work that has been announced with very, very strong budgetary measures behind it today will continue, sometimes outside the public eye, with the communities at the forefront. So there's a dual job here that is obviously reflecting on these things, but also working with the communities in their search for something that, as Senator Sinclair said so eloquently, comes before reconciliation, which is the search for the truth. And the truth is painful, but it's essential to healing. And so, I can reflect on this all day, but I think the importance is to ensure that as a minister of the Crown, that work is being done, but work is being done in a way that's respectful of communities' wishes and the continued need to move forward relentlessly on this. And I think the investment of this government of both political capital and economic capital is important. It's important foremost for how we see ourselves as a nation and how we respect Indigenous peoples in a way we haven't up to now.
If I can add, we are really dealing with a couple of centuries of damage to Indigenous nations. Canada's first policy objectives on dealing with Indigenous nations, or Indians as they were uniquely called then, was to first policy objective was to civilize. Second policy objective was to Christianize, and the third one was to completely assimilate, to beat the Indian out of the person. And we are dealing with centuries of underfunding. So really, this is an exercise of self-determination in partnership with Métis, with First Nation, with Inuit nations, and that's going to take generations to be where we want to be, but we need to do it respectfully, in partnership, co-development, to move self-determination along, and be there as a federal government to support nations all the way through the process, and do what we have to do to reform the system. And I think we've made progress on child welfare. We've made progress on languages. We've made progress on UNDRIP. The Day of Truth and Reconciliation will be is in the Senate now, if it hasn't been passed already. That will be one day per year, where there's an incredible opportunity to get to our young people in our schools, junior high and younger, elementary, through education. And education is the way out of this. It's certainly key, but it's going to take time. It's going to take time, and it's going to take the will of all governments to want to get it done in partnership.
Thank you, Minister. Olivia, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. In your answers to my colleagues, it doesn't sound like you're open to an international investigation into the discovery in Kamloops. So I'm wondering instead, would your government support the call for an inquiry into residential school burial sites that Murray Sinclair is calling for?
Again, Olivia, I'll repeat it if it wasn't clear enough. The nations and communities involved have to be at the forefront of this, and they will tell us what to do.
I totally agree with that, Olivia, and I also, just in your former question, this week has opened the eyes of many Canadians, like George Floyd did, like Joyce Echaquan. They now know the truth. You can't unknow the truth. And I hope that every Canadian now understands their role in decolonizing, in healing, in being able to learn how to be allies, such that this becomes part of the DNA of every Canadian, so that no future government could ever roll it back or slow it down. We've got to get there together on the journey of righting wrongs and true partnership and reconciliation.
Thank you, Minister. So we've now reached the end of our press conference. Alors, c'est ce qui met fin à notre conférence de presse. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you all a great day.